This is Leading Detection, a Sedulo podcast where fraud fighters talk tech. Welcome back to the Leading Detection podcast. Today we're joined by Hanjo Seibert. What an episode we've got in store today. Hanjo is not only his own podcast host in this space, he's a managing director and partner across risk and compliance at one of the leading strategy firms in the space. Wealth of experience, lots that we can tap into today, and even had a TED talk in this space as well. Hanjo, thank you so much for joining.
Hi everyone, and thank you for having me, Matt.
Perfect. So it's going to be quite a zoomed out session today. You've got a great kind of viewpoint from the work that you do across the industry at different companies, different environments, situations, domains. So we're going to talk a bit of an overview about technology and in the risk compliance, and then zooming into the fraud space as well. So why is it important that we're talking about this today? Where's this coming from?
So, I think technology has been around a lot in the compliance, fraud, AML space for the last 2 decades, I would say, at least. Why I think it's even more important now is with all the innovation that we see in Gen AI, agentic, and a lot of the focus on the big tech work. This is posed both a threat and an opportunity. A threat from a perspective of, obviously, the fraudsters are not sleeping, so they're employing the same technologies we have at hand, often even at greater speed in adoption. And an opportunity, of course, because for us as an industry, or for both public and private, the use of technology, the ability to scale up analytics, to scale up tech solutions becomes much, much more important, but also much, much more accessible. So I think in that rat race and in that shifting dynamics, it'll be interesting to see who's going to win in that market from a both fraud perspective, but also from a protection perspective in the industry.
And you've been around the space for quite a few years now. What's the evolution been? Because fraud's front and center for a lot of companies now. How's that kind of evolved?
So, it has evolved quite a bit, and it is evolving as we speak. So I think from that perspective, and if I focus, I do a lot of my work in the financial services sector. So if I look at that, I think it's a very interesting question. I think the first part of my answer would be we need to disentangle fraud as a meta topic into the different fraud categories, because when we look at, for example, onboarding fraud versus payment fraud versus scams and all the impersonation and these kind of things, there's so many different varieties and nuances to the different topics. And those were just 3 examples out of probably 100 different taxonomy items within fraud. But broad strokes, generally speaking, what I think we're seeing is there's much more sophistication from a fraudster perspective in terms of how layered some of the fraud schemes can be, moving into, for example, the scams part in social engineering frauds, these kind of things, which are very, very hard to detect for institutions.
Yeah.
From an onboarding perspective, it's always a rat race, right? Where I think 10 years ago, we would have said, okay, we need to be better in so-called ID&V, so identity verification with online verification, video identification, because photo doesn't suffice anymore. We need to have liveliness check of people moving their heads and so on. Now, with a lot of the deep fakes and the capabilities that technology provides, I guess there's a lot of the part that the solutions that worked 10 years ago don't work today anymore because they're so easy to fake and circumvent. And 10 years sound a lot in a single person's history. Like if I look at what I did 10 years ago or how my family looked 10 years ago, that's a long time.
Yeah.
For a large global institution, 10 years in terms of implementation, when you set something and decide today, I want to have this solution, I want to redesign my process in that way, 10 years, or let's say 5 years, is not a big time frame, right? So in that sense, it's also the challenge of what we've decided 10 years ago and then started to implement and now have running maybe for a couple of years is already outdated. So how do we manage as executives, as managers of our firms? How do we manage that part that it doesn't become a change fatigue or something where we're currently renovating? And I mean, I grew up in Cologne, so the Cologne Cathedral has been renovating and hasn't been finished for like about 800 years, right? So every time you think you're finished, you can go back to the start and start renovating. So we ideally don't want to have that situation, right? But it is a time and place now where I guess the challenge is, can I be fast enough in my implementation and at the same time implement the governance and the validations that I need to have in order to be robust, at the same time staying ahead of the curve from an innovation perspective?
And have you seen that timeline beginning to shrink? Because if you went back 10 years ago, right, and you said to people that, having an interview, a virtual interview, was a high risk of being fraudulent, you couldn't maybe imagine it. Whereas now it's common practice and something that you need to detect for. So is that timeline of 10 years shrinking, or how do you advise on that planning?
Absolutely, it's shrinking. And I think it's, again, a threat and an opportunity at the same time. I think if you look at the winners in the market, for them, the shrinking timeline is an advantage, because if I'm able to implement all the organizational capabilities I need to have, then shorter time frame means faster time to market on innovation, closer customer proximity, better interaction with my clients and customers. So for the winners, I think it's an advantage. For a large part in the majority of the market, it'll be more of a challenge from a perspective where there's a technical possibility to shorten the time frames, to go more into an agile setup, more sprints and so on. At the same time, you have a lot of organizational complexity with regards to model governance, innovation, validation, audits, and so on. How do you bring in that possibility of reduce time to market, faster turnarounds, and at the same time mobilize your organization to capitalize on that opportunity? And I think that's where I see a lot of companies struggle at the moment to see, from a technology perspective, it's possible. Fraudsters are innovating faster, so there's clearly the ability to innovate faster. At the same time, there are a lot of organizational constraints. So all of a sudden, I'm at a disadvantage, like for like, because if the fraud side is innovating faster and I'm still bound to my legacy timelines in terms of a change takes at least 12 months to implement organizationally, then I have almost doubled the multiple of fraud innovation versus detection and prevention innovation.
Is fraud in a unique position here because of how quickly it evolves, and it's an external factor, right?
Yes and no. I mean, there are certainly a lot of uniquenesses and specificities to fraud. On the other hand, I would even say that we see a lot of innovation in the fraud side, because for most industries, most companies, fraud is mostly an economic loss perspective on that side of things, versus if we go into the AML space, so the anti-money laundering space, that's much more regulated. The biggest threat to banks or institutions is fines and scrutiny from the supervisors or authorities. So in that sense, you could say fraud is at an advantage because they can be much more flexible in innovation, because if something goes wrong, it's an economic balance sheet consideration on loss absorption, versus in AML, it's a slightly different discussion. And that's also, when I look at banks, something we see for a lot of our clients, where in be that detection, be that in alert handling, be that in customer interaction, a lot of innovation is driven in the fraud department and then carried over to some of the regulatory compliance and AML, so anti-financial crime compliance topics, as they've shown that they are organizationally robust solutions.
So fraud is like the kind of sandbox for the compliance risk side of the businesses.
In a way, yes. I mean, I don't want to make them the guinea pig of everything, but from a positive perspective, they can be a driver of innovation for the broader compliance department if done well. And this if is a very big if statement, but I guess that's also what we want to talk about, where I actually would say, to my not to my surprise, because I've probably seen this kind of evolve, but what I would highlight is, in my experience, the biggest impact of success, non-success in this space, even though we talk about tech and innovation now, is actually the topics outside of the tech and innovation. So all the enablers on what people do you hire, how diverse is your skill set of your team, how digital native are they, how do you redesign some of the processes and again, I come back to the banking industry, but it applies to other industries as well. How much are you actually digitizing your processes, your interaction with the client? So for example, if I'm in retail banking, how digitized and how much changed are your processes with regards to your, say, retail banking app, the interaction with your clients and customers? Because the more you do there, the easier it becomes to also have the dialogue. And dialogue, I don't necessarily mean human to human, but the interaction for you as a bank with your customers from a fraud prevention perspective. Doing all the checks, the double checks on transactions to foreign countries, transactions to new accounts, to new counterparts, to new products, if we talk about the crypto space, etc. So all these kind of things can be built in by design much more in the interaction that you as an institution have with your clients, compared to if everything is very bifurcated, something goes through the kind of web page, something goes through the branch, something goes here and there, then it becomes a question on how do you kind of consolidate all the data points and then start your intelligence on top of that. So I think there's a lot of things outside of the pure how do I innovate my fraud detection and prevention capabilities that enable you to actually do fraud prevention and detection in a better way.
And fraud, in theory, comes before the laundering, right? So should the investment be more from a technology perspective? Should we be investing more in the fraud detection, prevention to support the compliance practices?
Yes and no. In my view, I think there's a lot of merit to it to start. If you're looking at the overall space, to start a lot of the innovation in fraud for some of the kind of freedom of innovation points I mentioned. Also because if I think about convincing the C-suite, the business case for fraud innovation is usually much easier articulated from a we gonna prevent or reduce fraud losses by X million, which is often triple digit millions or even billions of fraud losses reduced. So that business case is much easier to articulate compared to we're helping you avoid X million dollars of AML fines. So from that perspective, yes. Then I would say it's still something where all the things are equally relevant, right? Because I think the very adverse fraud event you want to prevent in the same way as the very adverse AML event. So in that sense, I think the scrutiny or the importance you place on the different topics is, I mean, hard to prioritize one versus the other, but I think if you take it as a roadmap or as a journey, I think there's a lot of merit to it to start in the fraud space.
And with difficulty of these technologies, because with AML you've got a bit of time, right? You can investigate. You've got longer than 500 milliseconds, right? Whereas in fraud you have to do things quite quickly. Would you agree that it's a much more difficult challenge for fraud tech?
Again, yes and no in a way, because I would also say so yes, there's certainly the real-time component. Once we go into the sanction and embargo screening parts of the BSA/AML frameworks, we're also in real time, so there's also that complexity in there. I'd say fraud certainly has a lot of challenges with regards to the kind of more real-time nature of it. On the other hand, I think it's from experience, it's also easier to articulate or design a client interaction based on fraud compared to AML. So if, for example, I'm your client and you contact me on, hey, are you sure you want to make that payment? Who has authorized this payment? Or you black screen my screen because you see there's a third party remote access control or something on my application, and you argue as a bank, you do this to protect me and my money, then yes, in the scams, that's where the engineering part comes in. In the scams space, I guess fraudsters still work on circumventing these controls, but I think it'll be easier for you as a bank to articulate why you're doing these things, why you're protecting me, compared to the AML space where, I mean, if you were to say that there may be 1% or less than 1% of your portfolio being fraudulent from an AML perspective, now you're annoying 99% of the portfolio with all these things where they have legit reasons to transact the money, and you put all these controls in. Plus, where you have investigations, the question of at what point in time do you want to interact with a client from a also tipping off perspective? So you might not want to interact with the fraudsters directly right away because that might scare them off before you even can do your investigation. So I'd say there's challenges certainly with fraud and the real-time perspective. I think for me the good setup, or the way how I would think about it, is how do I, for a lack of a better word, digitize, but how do I innovate my end-to-end customer journeys, and how do I build in fraud detection and prevention checks and controls into that process by design? Second, what do I need to build for that in order to create the right features or the right data in order to do that? What I mean as an example is, do I have capabilities to capture all, for example, the web session data? And it's certainly there. The question is, are you capturing that? And when you capture it, are you using that? So I'm talking about the device you're logging in with, the geolocation, the language setting, the speed and how you type in, remote access control, as we mentioned. So all these things, because those I can use directly for creating controls or rules on top of that to help interact, and be that block or be that lockout and new verification, these kind of checks and controls I can build in live and real time. And then third step, when I have the data, what do I do also from a more data analytics perspective to come up with new rules, to come up with new scenarios that I can then model? And if I do that well, yes, you can argue that, especially for the part of money laundering that is fraud related, if I'm better at fraud detection and prevention, then obviously the fraud preceding money laundering part helps me also downstream in my AML topics. That said, there's still a large part of AML that is not necessarily directly fraud related, which I still need to work on the same way I did before.
Yeah. Okay. And if we were to go to industry trends, you'll have many clients across the board. What questions are they coming to you with? What are they asking you, and how has that kind of changed in the past 12 months or so?
So, yeah, good question. I think the biggest topic for everyone, if I look globally, is how do we deal with scams? And this has different nuances in Australia and the UK, where the regulation also requires banks to where part of the compensation is also, or liability is with banks, or even on scams. But even for regimes that don't have that rule in place, the biggest challenge for the industry, how do we deal with scams? And my short answer to this would be, it's exactly down to that client interaction. There's a lot of what role do financial institutions play in financial education of the society? Because I do think there's a lot of social engineering that happens even before the scams happen, where clients might already be biased towards, oh, the banks are bad, they're just looking for profits and so on. And at that point, that scenario is already lost. So how do I deal with that part? Big challenge for the industry. The other part on how do I deal with all the fraudsters employing technologies? So, and this can go overlap with scams. But for example, if you also think about the phishing things, the old rules where you say, okay, look for bad language, look for typos, look for these kind of things. I mean, with Gen AI, I mean, they write better emails than most other humans would write, right? So some of these kind of trade-off for fraudsters where I can either go for high quality and have lower volume because historically I had humans involved in reviewing this, writing this, etc., versus I can go for high volume and low quality, which most of the fraud cases would be, where then the controls would be look out for poorly written emails and so on. This function is gone, right? Because as a fraudster, leveraging agentic AI and Gen AI, I can now go for super big volume at very good quality. So how do I deal with the change there in what I mentioned also at the start, the fraudsters leveraging technology, that's another very big part. And obviously, how much do I want to spend as a company now versus is there an option value in waiting half a year? Because who would have anticipated some of the big players in the agentic space 2 years ago? So if I now lock in and invest in something today, am I basically locking myself out for the innovation that might be coming in 6 months, 9 months time? And that trade-off from at some point I need to start acting, but what's the right time frame? That's another big challenge. There's a very big, and this is very banking specific now, but there's a very big focus, I think, in what we would call first-party fraud. So credit frauds where no money is ever paid back, or after the first or second installment, the fraudulent client runs and doesn't pay back. So, which is actually for me an interesting part, because if institutions are better in detecting first-party fraud, it helps them also differentiate from what is currently subsumed all as credit risk and credit losses into, hey, there's the credit risk and credit losses, and on the other hand, there's first-party fraud. If I separate the two, I can also be, as a second-order impact, be much more precise on modeling my credit risk. So this part where it's historically a lot of undetected first-party fraud, which gets subsumed and mingled into the credit risk, is a big point and ever more so important area of fraud to be able to detect well. And obviously there's much more things. I think the whole payment fraud, the classical payment fraud still stays the same as it was. I think with a lot of the digital assets, cryptocurrencies, that's an area that's become much more complex for banks and institutions to track and protect customer money in the way they were able to before. And obviously the whole, let me call it, social media phenomenon on social engineering there doesn't help either. But the classical payment fraud and card fraud perspective has also evolved into a much more complex scheme where at some point it becomes, as I mentioned, much more an overall, let me call it, target operating model question on how do I engage with the customer? How much education do I want to provide? What skills in my team do I have? How close are the different teams, compliance, risk, business, working together? Which becomes much more of a paramount question, because if you don't, you'll lose the rat race straight out.
Yeah. And how are you advising on this? Because like you said, there's so many different areas to fraud. You've got the lines blurring between credit defaulting and fraudulent activity, social engineering and scams, which don't necessarily happen on the banking platform, for example. So how are we advising these questions, and how are we kind of turning to technology to support?
No, great question. I mean, it's how does the saying go? Many ways lead to Rome. I think it's similar here, where we have different inroads in how we, or how I would come in and advise clients, and there's not the cookie cutter one kind of approach. What I would say where they kind of lead to usually, or in the best cases, is this target operating model discussion, the more strategic. How do you, like, how do you want to model your business 5 years down the road? And obviously this is a bit kind of crystal ball kind of thing, but from a perspective, what's my ambition? Where do I want to be? And actually having this discussion, and it may start as a compliance discussion. It may start as a, how do I build this control? It might be, how do I integrate this new tool and so on? But expanding that discussion from a pure compliance or risk discussion into a operating model and business discussion from that perspective, in my view, is the best approach, because then, at least from a design perspective, you should be very comprehensive. Then from an execution and delivery perspective, that is where you should be very narrow and focus on the things you've designed. But if you don't do the design on where do I want to be in 5 years, I have a hard time seeing how you would orchestrate a change that is structural and not tactical in every single silo. But how I personally advise is, I'm always trying to bring it back to, what does it mean for the bigger picture part, this kind of 5 years, where do you want to be? And then obviously, if we know where to locate that part, so for example, a tool change, better detection in fraud, or onboarding changes and these kind of things, then obviously one can go very narrow into a specific topic. And there's as many different inroads to how we would work together with clients as there are different themes that you can think about from a compliance perspective, more broadly speaking.
Yeah. Okay. So are you seeing companies realize they've got a fraud problem that they're seeing in the kind of industry, that it's become a growing problem, but they don't quite see how that affects them as a business? So it sounds like that's the first step.
Yeah, and I mean, there's most of the clients I work with, they have a reasonably good understanding what their fraud exposure is. I mean, they might not be tracking it down to the last digit, but they have a reasonably, intuitively at least, and most of them have numbers associated with that, understanding of where their weaknesses are and how big their exposure is. So it's, most of the times it's the discussion is more, say, around, what can I actually do in order to be better in detecting it from a live perspective? Because on the portfolio level, we understand roughly where we are, but how do I better detect it live? And how do I better prevent the fraud from happening? Plus, how much money can I and how much money should I invest in becoming better in fraud detection and prevention? Because that is obviously the discussion with the business, where it's an investment first. So that needs to be prioritized vis-a-vis all the other investments that I want to do as a company.
And as we are now, and it's as an average, do you think, what's holding us back? Is it the technology that's available? Is it the people in the industry? Is it investment? Is it change management? What do you think the thing holding us back is right now?
It's probably all four things that you mentioned.
Okay.
Now your follow-up question will probably be, but yeah, if you had to prioritize. So I think it's out of the four, it's probably the first that comes to mind is the change management. Because I think if I were to speak to fraud and compliance professionals, we all know about the problem. We all know about our kind of constraints and challenges. Then a lot of people, I'd say probably half or more than half of the people, they roughly know how good would look like. But then the question is, so next to all my day-to-day challenges, next to my constraints, capacity constraints, budget constraints, yada, 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 how do I actually start? And this whole uncertainty around, do I have the right people already in order to execute that change for me? Do I have the right timing? Back to this point of, if I now start a big program, is it now the right time, or should I wait 6 months to see how others do it, to have technology kind of mature even further? So that change management is probably the biggest sticking point right now. My view on how to solve it is, if I look at, like, similar to building a house, I think architecture comes before the build.
Mm-hmm.
So if I now start and this can be a very small group exercise, but if I now start designing how the future should look like, back to this point of 5 years down the road, how should it look like? If I'm able to articulate that and design it, and then take the individual compartments of that more strategic target picture to say, well, then I know I need to change this, or I know I want to move more of my client interaction into the banking app, or I want to do this, or I want to track more of the web session data. There are things that I can do now that are, you could call it no regret moves or things, but that help me design a roadmap where I know, okay, I'm tackling the things I know for sure. I tackle the things that start enabling me or that help me, that have no optionality right now, like hiring the tech-minded people, hiring forward deployed engineers into the teams, resetting part of my structure from a very rigid org design into more agile setups where I have fraud expert people, business people, forward deployed engineers, tech data engineers people coming together that learn from each other, which will help me regardless of how I then steer the ship 2 years down the road, left or right, but that I can execute now. And what I can articulate, because I've done the architectural design up front, is to articulate how this initiative fits into my overall strategic plan that I'm trying to deliver within the 5 years. And the picture itself, how 5 years in the future looks like, will probably change 10 times down the road. But compartmentalizing it and saying, given that's where I want to steer as my, call it North Star or however you want to call it, that I can execute now with a very high degree of certainty, I think that is something that we see today already with the leading institutions.
So it's not necessarily having a goal per se, it's just making sure you have a direction of where you want to head in the timeline. Oh, excuse me. And if you are looking at indicators and how things are changing, how would you suggest the outlook is for the next kind of 12, 24 months?
I mean, I'm very excited about the change in the next 12 to 24 months, because what we've seen in the last 12 months is, I think, a pretty stark rise on the sophistication of the fraud. So what I think needs to still kind of catch up a bit is the sophistication of the detection, or I always say detection, but I mean detection and prevention. Yeah. So I do think that in the different compartments, if we talk about payment fraud, onboarding fraud, scams, and so on, I think there's a lot of capabilities in terms of capturing more data, interacting more interactively and more timely with the clients or counterparts and third parties and so on, and detecting and preventing the actual fraud. So I'm very excited about all the change that is down the road in the next 12 to 24 months on that on that front. And again, I think the way how to execute well is to lock down what you know now with a high degree of certainty and not get too confused about all the other 10 things that you don't know with high certainty. But my advice to anyone listening would be, don't get paralyzed because you can't see the wood for the trees, because that's how the industry is. But try to identify the one tree that you're actually seeing, and do that one, and then worry about the next tree after you've chopped down the no, I don't want to chop down trees, but like after you've done and executed on the first.
And what needs to happen for that to occur?
What needs to happen? I think a lot of things, but if I try to drill it down to the top 3 that comes to mind, is I think as an executive or manager or leader in the fraud space or business, boldness in initiating the change, being the person to lead the charge and providing confidence to your team that, hey, we're getting out of our comfort zone. We cannot and we don't want to do things in the legacy way, how we did it the last 10 years, because the world is changing. So that ignition, I think, is needed from a management and leadership perspective, point one. Point two, from a team perspective, the curiosity to learn new things. And I mean, I personally, even though I'm in the space of consulting and strategy and change, I personally also have my resistances, right? If I look at my day to day and hey, but overcoming some of those and say like, hey, how can I start introducing some of the innovation, Gen AI and agentic, and not everything might sustain, right? If I think of like using Gen AI to triage my own inbox, yes, I'm testing this. Will I keep it? To be seen, right? But the process of going through that and evaluating how does this help me, or learning how to use Gen AI and MCPs and MD files and these kind of things, is helping me overall in getting up the maturity curve. So as a team member, I think the curiosity to continue to learn and not to be afraid of failing in that sense, because I know in a lot of the Western culture organizations, the failure culture is one of the big blocking points. But having the curiosity as a team, I think, is important. And from a C-suite and leadership perspective, I think this willingness to think in an integrated way, to not think, hey, this is business, this is customer, this is revenue generating, this is compliance, this is fraud, blah, blah, blah. But as we discussed before, to really come together as one team and think about, how do I bring my company forward? And I don't care about the silos in the first place. In the second place, then I worry about it, because that's where all the responsibilities land. But how do I design my client interaction? How do I design my business of the future in an integrated way where compliance comes by design? And I think it needs that additional push from the C-suite, because that is where it's above the individual department responsibilities and the silos and the politics.
Mm-hmm. And to put you on the spot, who is the best person to kind of be responsible and drive this change?
My view, business leadership. Because and you can affect it from different ways. And I work with clients where it can be starting from the fraud side, from the compliance side, from business, from the operations side. My view, the best way is if it starts from the business, involving, obviously, not excluding the fraud and compliance people right away. But if it is a business proposition on, we want to change, or we want to redesign and innovate the interaction we have with the client, and we want to use fraud as a positive capability that we can bring as part of our value proposition, and how we protect you as a client from fraudulent activity. How do we protect your account? How do we protect your data? How do we protect your money? I think that's the right and the best way to do it.
Amazing. Well, Hanjo, it's been an absolute pleasure having you join us today. This bite-sized episode. Hopefully, the listeners have got some takeaways that they can maybe investigate a little bit deeper. But we can't let you go without asking you what your kind of predictions are for this year and how you see things changing.
Oh, good one. So for the next 12 months, I would say, because the year has already half passed. So I think, and I don't know whether it's a prediction, because but I think there has to be much more focus on data and how we leverage data to come to insights. And with insights, I mean detection scenarios, better detection, better prevention, those type of things. So my prediction number one is much more focus on data, even more so, because data has been the discussion for the last 20 years, I feel. But especially for fraud, a great focus on data and what insights I can drive out from the data. Second, I think, and again, the same proposition has been out. That's why I say I'm not sure how much of a prediction it is, but it's an overused term, but agile, and how we bring integrated teams work together in much more reduced timelines in how we affect change. I think that's going to be paramount in order to drive any of what we discussed today. And Last but not least, I do think, unfortunately or fortunately, because it's a call for action, I think there's going to be much, much more change and sophistication on the fraud side, especially on the organized crime. So I'm less worried about the individual. I mean, and it's still bad, don't get me wrong. The individual kind of unsophisticated fraud that happens. I am more worried about the very sophisticated state nation level fraud that's happening, and this the organizational fraud and crime that's happening, and how they are able to leverage all the technology and the change that we see in the market.
Yeah, it's a little bit scary, but of course, the technology on our side, we're pushing through as well. But it's going to be an interesting 12 months. Anyway, if anyone wants to keep up with the work that you're doing, anything you've got coming up, or the podcast as well, where can they find you?
So anywhere where you listen to your favorite podcasts. So we are live with our own podcast, as you mentioned, Matt, BCG on compliance. So anyone who types that into Spotify or Apple Music or any other place where you find your favorite podcasts. Alternatively, LinkedIn, I have my profile. So if you also want to reach out there, contact me via email, via in message. I think there's enough ways to reach me and find out about the work that we do.
Amazing, and definitely some ones to have on your radar for the listeners. Do some great work, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.
And ciao for now.
Bye.
Want to hear more about fighting fraud with tech? Subscribe to Leading Detection wherever you get your podcasts.